You're on the rant couch where I rant about whatever my $15 a month plus patrons want me to rant about. You can get one of these by being one of those. This one's for Jacob Sartori, who says, rant about how goddamn retarded the number ranking system and why everyone is always too much of a bitch to rate anything higher or lower than 7 regardless of quality. Personally, if I have not already made it clear, I am not a fan of this system. The fact that rating out of 10 system forces a person to judge the entirety of the Monogatari series in the first 3 episodes of Umaru-chan or the same scale is the stupidest shit of all time. I don't really get where you're coming from with your problem with the 10 scale. I'm perfectly fine with it. I like the 10 scale, I just think most people use it wrong. And the biggest problem I have is that people use it like a high school grading system. Like, people look at it as, oh, a 7 out of 10 means a 70%. That's like a C or a D or whatever, you know? And it's because of the fact that they think of it that way that they give what they consider a passing grade to something, on the basis of like, okay, well, okay, let me back up for a second. Like, in school, if you were to get less than like a 60%, it basically means that you didn't understand enough of the logic behind how you get the answers to the problems for you to make it to the next stage. Like, you need to understand at least 60-70% of what's going on, or else when we move on to the next lesson, you're going to be too far behind. You're going to be too lost because you're not getting the basic fundamental logic of what you're supposed to be doing here. And so if you compared that to let's say a video game, as long as the game is competently made, it should be getting a 7. That is the logic of this system, and it's why so many game reviewers give like almost everything a baseline 7. Like, if you get less than a 7 in like Game Ethic, Game Informer, or like a IGN, it means your game is broken. Like, it means that you fundamentally don't know how to make the game correctly. Something is too wrong for you to be able to make another game successfully, you know? But that doesn't really make sense as a way to judge art, because we don't, like, if we're just judging each game on its own terms, then those scores have nothing to do with the next game that you review. It's like you're giving each one a grade out of 100, but like, if a game gets 100 at doing one thing that's ultimately not that interesting of a thing to do, and another game gets 100 at doing something that's really impressive, then it's like, okay, well, you've given them both 100, but one is more interesting than the other. So, because of the fact that the scores are to compare different things to each other, that is their purpose, is to say this thing is better than this thing, then it should not be about how well does it achieve its own goals. It's how well does it stack up to other things. How much better or worse is it than the next thing? And a lot of people see it as like, well, how can you compare things that are unlike? Well, you're not really comparing them in the sense of like, how did they each handle the same aspect? It's just like, how good is it overall? Like, how good is it at whatever it's trying to do? How does that compare to other things? So, for instance, like, I give a 10 out of 10 to, let's say, Sangatsu no Lion. And the reason I give it a 10 is because it is just better than something I would give a 9. Let's say Humanity Has Declined, which is a great show. But the show only explores so many ideas. It is not as visually interesting. It doesn't have as many interesting characters. It doesn't have as involving or as emotional of a narrative. It has a lot of cool ideas in it, but there's just not enough greatness in it that I would say that it's as good as Sangatsu no Lion, which has just overflowing amounts of greatness. Either one has certain flaws. You know, I wouldn't give it a 10 out of 10 because I think it's flawless, because you can make something that's flawless but not interesting, that has no mistakes, but there's just nothing about it that, would put it above the thing that you also gave a 10. So, like, it should be that each score is just like, how does this compare to everything else that currently exists? Whatever is a 10 is the best thing that you know of, and everything else is scored against that. So, you know, when you score things that way, it tends to be that, you're just going down, like, you're kind of going down and from the top and going up from the bottom. So like you're giving a 1 to the worst thing you've seen, right? Well, okay, this thing was better than that thing, so it's a 2. And then at some point when these two lines converge, you should end up in the middle. You should end up at a 5 or a 6. That should be, and personally, I just kind of judge it as like anything that's a 5 or below is something that I ultimately did not like. Anything that's a 6 or above is something I ultimately did like. It fell into the top half or the bottom half, the acceptable or the unacceptable list. You could honestly scale it differently. I mean, like, if you just took, like, IGN reviews and just sliced off 5 numbers, I think they'd make more sense, you know? Like, just make it so your number 4 is average and then just work up from there. You know, like, it would make more sense because the amount of difference between the 7 out of 10 and the 10 out of 10 is a lot greater than the amount of difference between the 7 and the 5 that they give out, you know? Like, the only difference between their 7 and 5 is that the 5 has more technical problems, whereas the 7 might be just like a very bland average game, and the 10 is like an absolute masterpiece that's, thought through in every single way. It's like if you were to give a game like, say, Days Gone a 7 and Dark Souls a 10, it's like the vastness of difference when you ignore just the fact that either one is technically proficient, the vastness of difference in vision and technique and like thought put into the game should lower the score of Days Gone considerably, So yeah, that's how I feel about the scoring system.